Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jim Parsons. I'm the Research Director here at Vera. I'd like to welcome all the Verans who are here today, and also those who brave the elements to join us in person from outside of Vera, and also people who are joining us remotely via WebEx. We use microphones for the discussion and also for the Q&A so that people who are remote can hear the conversation. I am delighted to introduce Dr. Raphael, who will be talking about his work on criminal justice reform in California today. Before I introduce Dr. Raphael, I just want to give a couple of notes and updates. So firstly, just to introduce the speaker series, at Vera we invite speakers who are doing cutting-edge research around the country and sometimes internationally to present their work at Vera. This is great for our staff to hear about the work and also to build a community of justice reform where we can come together and hear about great work that's happening in the field. The speaker series is named after our former research director, Neil Weiner, who passed away, and we named this series in his honor. Before I introduce Dr. Raphael, I'd just like to note a quick date for your diaries. We have the next speaker series will be on March 2nd, and Dr. Brain from UT Austin will be talking about police surveillance in the age of big data. So mark that in your diaries. And also, if you want to live tweet, you can tweet along with us using hashtag VeraRSS. And so, as I mentioned, Dr. Raphael will be talking about his work on criminal justice reform in California. Dr. Raphael is a professor of public policy at UC Berkeley. Traveled across the country to be with us today. He holds the James D. Marver Chair at the Goldman School of Public Policy, and his research focuses on the economics of low-wage labor markets, housing, and the economics of crime and corrections. His most recent research focuses on the social consequences of large increases in U.S. incarceration rates, and also a topic which much of Vera's work has focused on as well as racial disparities in criminal justice outcomes. Dr. Raphael also works on immigration policy, racial inequality, the economics of labor unions, social insurance policies, homelessness, and low-income housing. He is the author with Michael Stoll of Why Are So Many Americans in Prison and the new Scarlet Letter in negotiating the U.S. labor market with a criminal record. Raphael is a research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, the California Policy Lab, University of Michigan National Poverty Center, University of Chicago Crime Lab, IZA, Bonn, Germany, and the Public Policy Institute of California. He holds a PhD in economics from UC Berkeley, and I'm very glad to welcome him to talk about his research at Vera today.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for coming out in the rough weather. So a lot of the work today I'm going to talk about is joint with a colleague named Magnus Lofstrom, and I'm going to try to boil down a series of papers we've been writing over the last 5 or so years on reforms that have happened in our home state. And hopefully what we want to do is to think about what are the lessons that we can learn from this in terms of corrections policy, and maybe what can be learned for other states that are thinking about changing directions and changing course. So just to give you a brief overview of what happened in California. So for most of the run-up in incarceration rates in the United States, California and the U.S. were in lockstep with one another, right? So if you look back to the early 1970s when incarceration started to rise everywhere, it started to rise in California, through the 90s and through the 2000s, many of the reforms that were introduced across the country, from moving from indeterminate sentence and determinate sentencing, mandatory minimums, Threestrike laws, and so on and so forth, were all happening in California as well. And not surprisingly, what we saw in our incarceration rate is that we sort of charted what was happening nationally. And then what ends up happening in the mid-2000s is California starts to come under a lot of pressure because the prison population roughly doubled the rated capacity of the system. And so we had extremely crowded conditions, inmate lawsuits pertaining to those conditions that ultimately resulted in federal court action that required the state to do something about it. And basically what ended up happening is over a relatively short period of time, about 5 or 6 years, there were a series of reforms that basically reduced our prison population by 1/3. Some of it was forced on the state by federal courts, and some of it, on the other hand, was basically passed by voters, right? So the California voters, in many ways, had a change of heart when it came to correction policy and criminal justice. And so what I want to do today is I want to talk about 2 reforms in particular. I'll give you some sense of the other things that have happened that I think are the biggest and perhaps most important, to try to understand, roughly speaking, how they affected this change that we're seeing in this period, also how it impacted the jail population, because that's an important component of the story. What are the implications for public safety in the state, right? What do we know about the impacts on crime? And then also, what do we know about the effects of these changes on racial disproportionality in our criminal justice system in California relative to the rest of the nation? So that's roughly speaking what it is we're going to do. Okay, and I'll take like 30 minutes or so, and then hopefully we can have conversation. So in terms of the major reforms that have happened in the state, I just wanted to point to a few things that the state have done, and we're going to focus in particular on 2 that I think are perhaps the most important or have had the largest impact. So as I had mentioned, the state was actually under pressure and ordered by a federal court to reduce prison overcrowding. And to some degree, the state contested that order. It had appealed to the Supreme Court. Which was ultimately, the appeal was overruled and the state was forced to act. But before the state was forced to act, there were a number of things that were tried, right? So there were some propositions that were passed. Just to give you one example, in 2099, there was an assembly bill that tried to incentivize localities to reduce the rate at which probationers were being revoked, and with the promise that they would cost share with the locality. Earlier on, there was a proposition that essentially lightened drug sentences to try to divert people away from prison. But none of that really worked, although it did reduce the population a little bit. What ended up happening is we ended up having a series of actually pretty big reforms starting in about 2011. The first one, corrections realignment, is one we're going to spend a lot on. And basically what corrections realignment did was basically realigned responsibility to localities, the management and punishment of what we're going to define as relatively less serious offenders in a very specific way, and that was going to be the first major reform we went through. In 2012, voters altered or passed Proposition 36, which basically narrowed the scope of who could be what qualifies for a second and third strike and for the sentence enhancements associated with that. In 2014, California voters passed Proposition 47, which is another one of the propositions we're going to spend a lot of time talking about, where essentially what happened here was lots of, or a subset of offenses that can be charged as either felonies or misdemeanors were redefined as straight misdemeanors, and that had consequences for both prison and jail population. And the most recent reform, Proposition 57, is one that actually is going to impact terms for people that are in prison, right? So many of these things, as we're going to see, are impacting the flow rate into prisons, while Prop 57, we haven't seen the effects of that yet, are likely to shorten sentences. And basically, what Prop 57 does is incentivizes prison inmates to program to not engage in institutional misconduct in exchange for basically shorter terms. But as you can see from this laundry list, the state is in reform mode, right? Some of it is being pushed by the crisis that happened in our prison system, and part of it is simply reflecting a change in the politics surrounding correction as being expressed by California voters for specific propositions. Sure. Oh, yeah, sure. Maybe put it closer. Uh-oh. I broke the lanyard. All right. Is that better? People out there in the Twittersphere? Yeah. Oh. Well, let's see. All right. Okay, so I'm going to focus on these two with some in some detail, corrections realignment and Prop 47, because these are the reforms that I believe have had the biggest effects. So let's just go over what happened with corrections realignment. So again, as I noted, right, this particular piece of legislation was the state legislator and the governor's response to basically being ordered by the federal courts and ultimately the Supreme Court to reduce overcrowding. So what the state basically did was it defined a series of or a group of people who were convicted of crimes or who were doing time as triple non-offenders, and those are people that by virtue of what it is they committed and what's in their criminal history are deemed non-sexual, non-violent, non-serious, and basically anyone who is deemed a triple non-case would do their time in a county jail instead of a state prison. So essentially what that does is going to cut the flow into state prison, increase the flow into county jails, and you would expect reduce one population without and increase the other. The other perhaps more important reform in terms of its numeric impact is the state basically realigned a lot of people who were coming out of prison from being on the parole caseload, where parole is a state agency, to being on the probation caseload, where probation is run by the counties. So there was a new sort of community corrections program created called post-release community supervision, where offenders who had relatively less serious offenses that they were coming out of prison for were now going to be monitored by probation officers rather than parole officers. And perhaps the most important change was that all of these folks that were on PRCS could no longer be revoked back to prison, right? So if they got a technical revocation or had some violation of the terms of their supervised release, they would be violated by a sanction that occurred within the community or violated the local jail, and that had an immediate impact on the prison population. So just to give you a sense of roughly speaking what happened, what this graph is showing is weekly admissions to the California Department of Correction and Rehabilitation, CDCR, in the weeks leading up to realignment and the weeks right after. And what you basically see is that, we were admitting on the order of 2,200 people a week, okay, for the sort of few months before, right, realignment. And then realignment passes, and literally within 1 month of the reform, admissions to prison drop to 500 a week, right? So we have a really substantive first order decline in admissions. Now, of course, most of this drop is going to be associated with people that were on parole and who are having their parole revoked at relatively high rates. In essence, these folks who were going back for relatively short spells. Nonetheless, it led to this dramatic drop in turnover in our state prison population. Now, what happened to releases? Okay, generally speaking, the system is sort of in equilibrium, so to speak, or steady state, when the number of people that are being released equals the number of people that are being admitted. What we saw with releases is that releases dropped too, right? But releases dropped at a slower rate. So, we were admitting roughly 2,200, 2,300 people a week. We were also releasing 2,300 people a week. And then what happens is admissions fall through the floor. And then as those people that we were admitting for relatively short periods were not coming out a few months later, releases started to drop as well, and ultimately they really re-equilibrate at this lower level, right? So we have just less churning into the system, fewer people in the reception centers in the prison, and ultimately we had a reduction in our prison population that I'm going to show you in a minute. Now, the second reform I'm going to talk about is the more recent of the two. So Proposition 47 passed in 2014. It was passed by 60% of California voters. It basically made three major changes. So it reclassified a whole list of drug offenses from wobblers to misdemeanors, right? Many were offenses that simply involved possession. It also redefined a series of property crimes, as long as the value was less than $950 of the amount that was involved in the offense, from crimes that could be charged as either a felony or misdemeanor to charge that would be charged as a misdemeanor. And then the proposition also allowed for resentencing and reclassification petitions for those who had prior felonies. So if you were currently serving time in prison, you could file a Prop 47 petition to have your sentence altered. Or if you had a prior conviction, you could file a Prop 47 petition to have your conviction altered from a felony to a misdemeanor. So it's, again, a pretty big change. Now, what happened here? Well, there are a few things that really pop out of the data when you look at them. So the first is what this top figure is showing is the number of bookings, monthly bookings into a California jail, and what we're measuring here is month relative to 2014, where the red line is essentially where the proposition goes into effect. And basically what you see is that monthly jail bookings just declined sharply, okay, from 87,371 on average to 78,773. The other thing you see, which is kind of an interesting story, so in addition to the prisons being overcrowded in California, the jails are also overcrowded. Many of the county jails are under their own court orders to relieve overcrowding. And one of the ways that the jails deal with overcrowding is they emergency release people, or they release people due to capacity constraints. And what we see pre-post Prop 47 is that those decline too, right? So we had an average of about 13,000 a month, and it declines to 8,000 after Prop 47. So you get a palpable sense that population pressures in county jails have declined. The other thing we see is that there's an immediate drop in prison admissions, this blue line, okay? There's an immediate increase in prison releases, right? Most of that is going to be people filing petitions to have their sentences reclassed, or to have their sentence to be resentenced, because now they're a misdemeanor instead of a felony. Although there were other population reduction measures that CDCR coincidentally implemented at the same time, or coincident with Prop 47. But the other one thing I want to note here is that when we look at where that decline in admissions come from, basically we're seeing that the decline is coming from a decline in admissions basically for drug offenses, right? So if we look at this decline in admission rate, it's almost all due to drug offenses, right? And so that's basically what happens, right? So you can think of Prop 47 as operating more really on the front end, right, before cases even get into the court and even they're being hired. So, a couple other things. Okay, this is sort of another interesting pattern that you see in data that we're still analyzing, and we're trying to flesh out to really understand what happens here. There also appeared to be a response on the part of law enforcement, okay, in terms of arrest behavior and what they were arresting people for and how they were charging them, or how they were writing up the incident when it was being presented to district attorneys. So what this figure is doing, this is from a data set called the Monthly Arrest and Citation Registry. It's micro-level data on arrests made in the state. These are arrests for person offenses, arrests for property offenses, arrests for drug offenses, and for all other offenses we define 4 mutually exclusive categories. And again, we measure month relative to November 2014. The blue lines are felony arrests, the red lines are misdemeanor arrests, right? So violent crime, you don't see much happening there. But for property offenses, basically what you see is, we have, thousands of property arrests between 6,000 and 10,000. I think it's like around 8,000. And then you hit November 2014, and those drop discretely, and you don't really see an offsetting increase in misdemeanor arrests, right? It almost looks as if there was a reduction in enforcement. For drug offenses, on the other hand, you see precisely what the proposition, what you would have predicted given the nature, right? That essentially felony arrests drop for drugs, misdemeanor arrests go up. If you add the two together, there's still a decline in arrest activity as the officers are arresting fewer people since they're no longer felonies. And the main thing we're getting from this is that, if we look at these two pictures on the diagonal, right, that there appears to be a decline in the likelihood of being arrested for a property offense, appears to be a decline in the likelihood of being arrested for a drug offense, and conditional on being arrested for a drug offense, you're more likely to be charged with a misdemeanor and a felony, and they're very sharp changes that happen relatively suddenly, okay? So what are the effects on the jail and the prison population? So here's the weekly prison population leading up to realignment, right? This is before we have that big change in admissions and releases. And then, bam, there's a big decline, right? So we have, on the eve of realignment, about 164,000. By when it hits its lowest point, it's a little over 130,000, starts to rise again, and then Prop 47 goes into effect, and we have another change, right? And by the end, this is that pre-period where there was all those other smaller reforms occurring, but we have a drop from 164,000 to below 130,000 over a relatively short time period. Okay, what happens to county jails? Again, this is the monthly average daily population of all the county jails in the state. This is the pre-realignment period. Post-realignment happens, and we have a lot of people who are now doing time in the county jail instead of the prison. It turns out that this increase doesn't entirely offset the decline in prison. It is about equal to about a third, right? So there's a 24,000 person reduction in the prison population and about an 8,000 or 9,000 person increase in the jail. So there's fewer people incarcerated overall, as we're about to see. And then Prop 47 goes into effect, and it basically undoes the effect of realignment on the jail population. So big swings in a relatively short period. And then we can just see the total inmates. We add jail and prisoners together, and over this time period, there's a pretty sharp decline, right, in what's happening in California. Okay, all right. So that's the basic story. Now the question is, so what are the impacts of these things? So I'll talk a little bit about work we've done, and I'll try to be brief. I think the general consensus is the sky didn't fall. We had these big changes. There indeed are some instances where you can find crime effects on some crimes, but overall, as you're about to see, crime remains at relatively low levels in California. However, we can go through, right, a laundry list of things that are avenues by which these changes may have impacted crime through the various theories that social scientists have that link punishment to crime. So we know there's plenty of research that finds incapacitation effects or immediate incapacitation effects of detaining someone who's criminally active, and to the extent that we're releasing people who are criminally active, we'd expect to reverse that. There's lots and lots of research on general deterrence and the extent to which the prison sentence generally deters people or specifically deters people who have been to prison. I'm ambiguous about that research. I don't think it's as decisive as some people might think, but there's disagreement. People can be rehabilitated, or they might be specifically deterred by their experience, or they might be hardened by their experience and leave prison more likely to offend than when they came in, of course. And then, of course, in steady state where people are flowing in and out of prison, we have a different proportion of the population that have been incarcerated at any given time, right? So an important point, and this is something that we wouldn't see for a while. It would take a while for that to filter through a population. And then with Prop 47, the things that have been discussed is, there seemed to be a decline in enforcement because there was a decline in arrest. Some people might say that perhaps there's more efficient enforcement because to the extent that people or that officers, DAs can focus on things other than low-level drug crimes, that perhaps that would lead to reductions in crimes for things that are more serious. And then there are fewer emergency releases, right, and which might be salutary in the sense that perhaps sheriffs might not be put in or be less likely to be put in a position where they have to release someone who they shouldn't have. Because of a capacity constraint. Well, we can start by just simply plotting out crime time series for California overall, okay? And just to make the general point that, here is crime from 1990 to the present. This 1990, this red line right here, this is basically where our incarceration rate is now, what it was in 1990. Okay, this is when realignment goes into effect. This is when Prop 47 goes into effect, and this is our official violent crime rate. So there's some wiggles here. I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens here because I think that's a measurement problem. But for the most part, crime rates remain at historically low levels. If we look at violent crime, if we look at property crime, we see something relatively similar to the rest of the country. Property crime peaked actually in the late 70s, not in the early 90s like violent crime. But we had large declines from 1990 onward. We have these two big reforms, brought our incarceration rate back to where it was here, and then we have some wiggles here, right? But for the most part, our property crime rates and our violent crime rates are generally speaking relatively are at historic lows, right? So to reverse a couple decades of incarceration, we didn't return to the crime rates of the early 1990s. That being said, right, we spent a lot of effort trying to understand what has happened in these areas and to identify what the effects are that we see. So we'll tell you what we find. So what this figure is doing is it's using something called a synthetic comparison method that basically uses a kind of computer minimization, or it's a minimization problem that tries to find an average of all the other states, okay, the sort of optimal average that best approximates California during some pre-intervention period, right? And that's what our comparison states, that orange line is. We used a sort of estimator to identify a group of states that found our synthetic California, so to speak, our counterfactual parallel universe California. And then we matched through 2010. And then what we do is we just say, okay, well, what happened to crime in synthetic parallel universe California? It's on the East Coast, say here. And then what happened in actual California, right? And what we're looking for is a departure, right? So we're matching on these, and we're seeing whether or not California departs from the counterfactual. And when you look at violent crime, there's basically nothing, right? So this is now our work on realignment that we've published and written several papers on. You can't really find much evidence that violent crime was impacted by this reform. On the other hand, for property crime, you do get some departure starting in 2012 and 2013 that it looks that like California's crime rate rises above parallel universe California. And what we had then done is we sort of tried to dig into the different Part 1 offenses, and what we found for the most part was a relatively small effect on auto theft was driving that, and that was pretty much the only effect we found. And it was on the order of, an additional auto theft per 1 unit, per 100,000 per 1 unit change in the incarceration rate. And you can do cost-benefit analysis on those sorts of things. And I guess in some ways it's a matter of debate regarding whether that's a big effect or a small effect. What we can say is that relative to research in the United States in the past, this is small. Okay, like if you were to estimate incapacitation effects in the 1970s, 1980s of putting one more person in prison, you get bigger estimates than what we found from California. And we've interpreted that generally as evidence that there's diminishing returns to scale in terms of the benefits of prison and crime control. Now for Prop 47, here are the data. We're not quite done doing research, but I can tell you roughly speaking where what we think we're seeing. Okay, so what this is doing is it's showing monthly violent crime, okay, in California, and here 0 is going to be November 2014. So this is from I think 2010 to 2016. There's property crime, and you can see that what we've done is we've done it with and without LA. The reason being that Los Angeles came under a lot of scrutiny in 2013 for underreporting aggravated assaults by a report that was published by the LA Times. The Inspector General of LAPD did their own report and estimated that they were misclassifying a fairly large number of aggravated assaults as simple assaults, to the extent that it was underestimating their aggravated assault rate by 30 to 40%. And in November 2014, they created a data integrity unit, literally the month that realignment went into effect, with the purpose of making sure the crimes were categorized and calculated accurately. And what you see in LA is that aggravated assault increases 40% over a 2-year period, and it's entirely due to the change in the reporting. And since LA is 10% of the state's population, it drives up crime. So what we did is we got Uniform Crime Report, or the sort of raw agency level data, and calculated the trends with and without LA to try to get a sense of whether LA is driving any of the patterns that we're seeing in the data. So what do you see here? Well, if you look at, and then there's another thing that happens, is that the definition of rape changes in 2013, and it's to be more expansive, and there's a mechanical increase. And in California, many of the bigger agencies don't implement it in the 2014-15. So I just want to throw those out to sort of that you keep in mind when we're, because we're going to do some tea leaf reading, and it's important to know, why the tea leaves look like that in those years. Okay, so anyway, when we leave LA in the T, you have what looks like a violent crime increase from 2014, 15, 16. These straight lines are the annual averages. When you drop LA, okay, you don't really see it, or it's much less pronounced. And in fact, when we do an analysis that tries to find a synthetic parallel universe California, what you find is that violent crime trends for California with or without LA really don't look like a statistically significant departure from what happens in other states. For property crime, on the other hand, there's some debate and there's some sensitivity to what we find depending on what method you use. So if we just look at here's 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16, you could imagine drawing a line through these and it would look like a trend, or you could imagine drawing a line through these and then it would look like these are a departure from trend, right? And so if you use the sort of 47 dynamics that you're observing in the time series to project forward, it looks like there's a 5 to 7% increase in property crime. On the other hand, actually it might even be a little more, if you do something where you're analyzing, if you look at what happens in comparison states, you also see something that looks like a sort of 5 to 7% increase in property crime. On the other hand, if you look at differences across counties in the effect of the proposition on the changes in the jail incarceration rate, the changes in arrests, the number of reclassification petitions, there's no visible relationship between counties that receive big Prop 47 shocks and counties that receive small Prop 47 shocks and the change in crime rates, right? So to some degree, we're kind of internally debating about what the effects are, but it does look like, and there are some methods you can use that suggest there was an effect on crime, mostly operating through larceny theft, but in the cross county analysis you don't see it. So I'll leave it at that. We can talk about it more in a minute. Okay, so the last thing I want to do is just say a few things about what are the effects of the change on racial disproportionality. So California, like other states, have huge differences in the degree to which African Americans are involved with the criminal justice system at all stages. There's some with Latinos and between Latinos and non-Latino white, but they're not quite as big as I'm about to show you. And they, and by no means do these reforms eliminate those differences, right? They're still pretty big. However, right, what you see is, when we were ramping up incarceration and we were really sort of becoming a punitive society, right? Racial disparities widened, and then here we have a situation where a relatively large state is kind of scaling back, and what you're seeing is that racial disparities narrow. Right, and so I guess in some ways it's obvious that's what would happen, but that's what would happen. And I can talk a little bit more also in a minute about, or maybe in the Q&A, about some work I did for the DA's office that might be suggesting some of the mechanisms at play. But anyway, so what this is doing here is this is just taking data from the American Community Survey, finding adults that are 18 to 55 years of age, and calculating the proportion that are in institutional group quarters on the day that the census taker basically enumerates them. For the most part, that's going to be people that are in state prison, local county jail, or in a federal prison. You can't net them out. And if someone is in a mental hospital, they'll be counted as well. There are few mental hospital inpatients in these age ranges, so we use this as a rough measure of basically the proportion that are detained in a correction setting on any given day. Here we have California males, here we have non-California males, and I'm just breaking it down into black, Hispanic, other, white, where the other and white and the black are all non-Hispanic black, non-Hispanic other, non-Hispanic white. Not a perfect way to do things, but it's the way we did it for this picture. And so what do you see? Well, on the eve of realignment, basically 9.6% of African-American males are incarcerated on any given day. It drops to 7.4%, right? So it's a 2.2% decline. If we look at what happens in other states, this kind of actually took me by surprise. I didn't realize this. I always thought California was like a moderate, incarceration state. But when you think about the demographics of the state, we have a relatively small African-American population. Our black incarceration rate was actually high relative to everybody else, right? We were at 9.6%. The rest of the country was at 7.9%. And there's some narrowing in the rest of the country too, because reform's happening elsewhere. But there was a bigger reform here, and it had a larger effect on African American males. There's also a slight decline in incarceration rate for Hispanic males, slight decline in incarceration rates for white males. For other males, you see also a small effect. But really, you can kind of see where there's a notable narrowing in the gap between any one group. So, for example, if you take 9.6 minus 1.5, right, that's an 8.1 gap, and it's dropping to basically a 6 percentage point gap. So it's narrowing the gap by more than a quarter, right, over this time period. The other thing, and this is for women, okay, for women you don't actually see any narrowing, right? Of course, the base rates are much lower. You still have racial disparities, right? The base rates are much lower, but we don't see anything that looks like a narrowing between African American women and white women. In fact, it widens a little bit over this time period. The other thing that's just worth pointing out, the final outcome that is relatively easy to tabulate and look at is the incident of arrest. So one of the things we've done is we've looked at the number of people who are arrested per 100,000 in the 12 months prior to Prop 47 and the 12 months following, and you see everybody's just generally less likely to be arrested right after the proposition goes into effect. But there's narrowing here that is greater than what we see for Hispanic and white residents of the state who are stopped by the police. Okay, so just a few other thoughts I'm going to offer, and then we can open it up. I don't want to talk too long. I know that's kind of boring to hear. I get tired of hearing myself talk. One of the things that we recently found, I worked with a colleague, John McDonald, on a large project at the San Francisco DA where we were studying racial disparities and how they were processing cases that came across the DA's desk. And, coincidentally, the data they gave us spanned the Prop 47 reform. So we had a couple years before, a couple years after. And what we found was that, number one, the composition of the cases they were receiving changed drastically, right? So they, the likelihood that the case was a misdemeanor declined. The likelihood that the individual that they were considering whether or not to prosecute was incarcerated or detained pre-trial declined. But the other thing that we saw was that the racial disparities and all of those things narrowed as well, right? So racial disparities in sentencing outcomes narrowed, racial disparities in the likelihood that somebody was detained pre-trial narrowed as well, like the racial disparities in the amount of time people were detained pre-trial narrowed. And essentially, those sort of differential inputs, so to speak, into the case processing outcome, the fact that those narrowed, the fact that you came in on a misdemeanor rather than a felony, meant that everything about your past, if you had a conviction in the past, mattered less when it came time to sentencing. And those particular channels, that change had a bigger impact on African American defendants that were coming into the office than white defendants, right? So in addition to just generally speaking, sort of narrowing that might be happening through, a differential treatment of people that are on parole, you had this narrowing that was operating through literally how cases were being processed from the beginning of a case to the end of a case associated with just reclassification of the crimes to misdemeanors. It's sort of a fascinating time, and it's an area for people who are doing research. I think that, there's lots of room, and the more the merrier in California, right? And a lot of exogenous policy change. So I hope that people in this room will study it as well. Okay, that's my story. So why don't, I'm happy to take questions. Is that?
I'd volunteer to Mike. Hi, I'm Ilsa. I'm with the Joyful Heart Foundation. Wow, that's loud. I barely need it. I'm wondering if you can talk about the effect of the downgrading of the felonies to misdemeanors on DNA collection. Because I have read that that cold case that.
No. That's a good, I don't know anything about that, but that's a good question. I will look into that. Thanks for asking that. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, Steve. So most of the reforms that you discussed impact low-level offenses, so the three nons or drug offenses. Do you have any sense of the extent to which they've changed the treatment of people who are arrested on violent offenses, if at all? And do you have any thoughts about how the profile of the impacts of these might play out if we were looking at reforms which targeted a different set of offenses? I know it's hard to say using the data, but if you have any.
Well, yeah, I mean, mechanically, the offenses that get longer sentences on a per admissions basis have a much larger effect on the incarceration rate, right? Because if, one admission for someone who stays there 20 years is like 20 admissions for someone who stays there 1 year, okay? If you think about it, that's just the mechanics of how a dynamic population evolves over time. So if you could imagine reforms that would shave length off people that have committed more serious crimes, it would probably have a bigger impact. It would probably have a bigger impact on this population. Now, in terms of the effect on crime, that's hard to say. What's interesting about the realignment reforms is that I think the people who are most impacted were the people who were cycling in and out of state prison many times, right? That they're folks that were engaged in repeated offenses, could not sort of manage what parole was demanding of them, have substance abuse problems, mental health problems. And oftentimes they were going back to prison not for a new offense, but for a technical parole violation, for not reporting, for absconding, for going out of the county, for violating some condition that was placed on them. And so I have heard people within CDCR tell me that the older inmates that have done more time, despite the fact that they have more serious sort of controlling offense, are that their gut instinct tells them they're less criminologically predisposed than some of the inmates who are doing less time and were cycling in and out under the old system. So it's hard to know what the impact of that is. Now, of course, there's the issue of, what is our metric? If we're utilitarian about it, then you want to let out the people who are the lowest risk. If you have a more just deserts framework, then you have a sort of different sort of set of standards by which you're making that public choice. It's hard to really resolve that issue.
Thank you so much. Chris Hendrickson from Vera. You ended your presentation on a couple of very interesting points. I think what you're saying is that what were ostensibly sentencing law changes influenced law enforcement decisions to arrest and prosecutorial decisions to prosecute. Could you please talk a bit more about why you think why that was happening? And also, I'd be very interested in hearing what police and prosecutors themselves have to say about that, given it seems not to be something that should be expected.
Yeah. So, well, Prop 47 is a controversial one. I'm not sure what's behind the decline in arrest. We've been trying to dig into that and try to understand at the agency level what is contributing the most. What it looks like, though, however, at least in the drug arrest case, is that with things being defined as misdemeanors rather than felonies, the overall arrest level seems to be less, that it's just receiving less priority than it otherwise would have. And then for property offenses, that in particular seems to be true, right? That when you see a sharp decline in felony arrests and no offsetting increase in misdemeanors, it suggests that some crimes that perhaps the police and some agencies are not responding. And so we're trying to dig in that to really understand exactly where that decline is coming from, whether it's shoplifting, whether it's breaking into cars or what have you. And it's a pattern that we really want to understand.
And I'll thank you for the follow-up, Lachey. Because I don't follow California closely. I sort of get it occasionally from the national news, and that you get the sense that, people are saying Prop 45 caused these property crime increases. It's a bad law, but I haven't heard it percolate out that, no, police aren't following up on these crimes anymore. So it's not about the law, it's about law enforcement.
Well, that's a good, well, so in some ways, I guess what our research has been focusing on is trying to understand what the crime effect is, okay? And that's, I think you're asking the deeper question is what is the mechanism at work? As I had mentioned, what we're not seeing in the data is we're not seeing evidence that counties that had bigger declines in their jail population saw bigger increases, or that counties that are processing higher volumes of resentencing and reclassification petitions are getting bigger increases in crime. But we're seeing what looks like evidence of higher than what one would have expected larceny theft, which suggests that there's some general deterrence effect. And that could operate via a lot of mechanisms. It could be the change in enforcement. It could also be the change. In incarceration. We can't find direct evidence of it. I think the one crime, I guess I didn't quite fully answer your question. So a lot of the police chiefs across the state don't like the law. A lot of the district attorneys, prosecutors don't like the law, right? So they feel like a tool has been taken away from them. And now the question, but at the same time, that was kind of the response to realignment as well, right? That reform doesn't engender response. But that being said, it's sort of incumbent upon the state, upon researchers and the research community to figure out if it's actually impacting crime and try to understand why and the best response to rectifying that.
Hi, this is Jacob King-Brown from Vera Institute as well. I had a question about the sort of LA Times report and how LAPD has changed reporting practices. I find that narrative to be pretty compelling, but I also wonder, these kinds of problems have been seen in New Orleans and New York City. There are probably many police agencies that are having this issue of underreporting aggravated assaults, overreporting simple assaults. And when the news hit in Southern California, do you think that other police agencies maybe started changing their practices as well, especially in light of this Prop 47 passing that they didn't like, and they have cover for increasing aggravated assaults because LAs are up too, and the sort of media narrative probably was a little more credulous of that and sort of was willing to go along with, oh yeah, crime's up. So.
Yeah, that's a great question. I did talk to one of the main analysts in the data integrity unit in LA because I wanted to ask. I guess what prompted us to look there is we were kind of looking at the data trends, and what we saw was this sort of sharp increase in aggravated assault. In 2015-16, and that seemed to be rise above anything else we saw. It's like, well, why would that increase and we wouldn't see, other increases in crime that you'd expect to be impacted by something like Prop 47? And then we started digging in county by county, and we saw, oh, this is all being driven by one county. And then, once we sort of honed in on the county, then we found the report and we got the Inspector General report. We had the conversation with Data Integrity Unit. And I asked them that question because I was like, well, if mostly I was interested is if it impacted other crimes as well, but it seemed primarily, at least from my conversation with them, that aggravated assault was the main crime that they focused their reporting efforts on. And I don't think it was actually a deliberate attempt to hide it was just essentially, I don't know if you've ever worked with charge data and the Uniform Crime Report sort of Part 1 offenses, but they're completely foreign to one another, right? It's almost like you have these charges and then you take a very complex crime and you try to force it into this box. That's the FBI crime category. And I think in the process of doing that, there are mistakes or not mistakes, but ways that agencies classify things that some might take issue with. Anyway, when I asked the people in LA, and I've asked people in other departments, does what LA is doing impact what's happening in Orange County or impacting what's happening in Long Beach or impacting what's happening in other? They were all like, no, we're totally siloed. We're not talking to each other. And they don't care what we're doing and we don't care. And I don't know if that's true or not. That being said, I've talked to other data analysts in major departments in California who know about what happened in LA. I don't know if it made them change their practice, but the consensus among all of them were kind of the skeptical, no one's paying attention to what we're doing and everybody does their own thing. So
Hi, I'm Shelley from Vera. I was listening to NPR on Sunday, and they had a show about men who committed 3 crimes in prison for over 250 years. Mm-hmm. Is that 3-strike rule over with, or is that still in effect?
Well, it's sort of, I mean, we still have 3 strikes, you know, the way it works is, you know, you have to have a first qualifying violent felony, and then at least the way the law was originally written, each subsequent felony made you eligible for sentence enhancement. Yeah. Right. So that's no longer the case. So well, I mean, he may still be in prison, but we passed a Proposition 36 in 2012 that narrowed what qualified as a second strike and then what qualifies as a third strike that gets someone the 25 to life indeterminate term. And so it was stories like that that led to that proposition, and it passed overwhelmingly. In the state, and you know, inmates in that situation can file for resentencing. Can file a resentencing petition. Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering if there's been much research on the kind of non-crime parts of life that get impacted by the incarceration rates, like especially the harder to measure stuff like quality of life, economic impact, children with 2-family homes or 2-parent homes.
Yeah, you know, there actually hasn't, at least to my knowledge, there hasn't been. There's some. I mean, there are a couple of qualitative papers that have tried to understand what it means to sort of be a realigned person versus somebody that was on parole. And you know, what was interesting is the Prop 47. You know, I think that for the most part, you know, it's definitely a move towards a lighter touch. It would be interesting for someone to see whether, you know, racial disparities within age ranges where the institutionalization rate is really high, say in employment has declined, or if you're just simply seeing movement of population from the box of incarcerated to not in work and not in school, right? I mean, I think that's something someone could do, and they could, you know, it'd be very easy to compare it to what happens to other states. I would like to see someone do research on living arrangements, whether minor children are more likely to be residing with their biological father. But it's, you know, it's sort of a wide open, it's a big policy shock in a big state, and it is somewhat under researched, right? And I think part of it is, you know, the research that exists has focused so much on the public safety angle and so much on the, you know, what does this mean for the California state budget and what does it mean for institutional populations, that those sort of collateral consequence questions have not been asked, or at least to my knowledge have not been studied to the same extent.
I think there was a question from someone who was joining online about recreational marijuana and, you know, the impact of the change in classification of marijuana over this period, how that had an effect on the things you were measuring.
That's a great question. I have not seen any research on California yet, right? But I think if one were to launch a project, the first place would be to look at differences in arrest, right, and try to get some sense of whether misdemeanor drug arrests have declined. And then go from there. But that's a great question. Relatively recent changes, we just, you know, it's now legal to sell and smoke marijuana in California recreationally as of January 1st. So it's a little fresh, but that's something worth looking into. Okay.
So I was surprised by the rates of the incarceration or custodial population by race. How, you mentioned that some of that is hospitalization. Do you have a sense of how much of that is hospitalization versus how much of it is the criminal justice system, or if there are other components of that as well?
Well, the hospitalization is a very small part, very, very small part of it. So that's part of the reason why when you're using that data, if you focus on 18 to 55, you pretty much have people that are in correctional institutions. If you look above 55, then you start to get people who are in convalescent homes or in some other sort of institutional group care that might be indicative of a health problem or cognitive decline. And so what researchers have done is they've limited it for that reason. It used to be the case that in the census, in the 1980 census and earlier, they actually split up the institutional group quarters into its component parts. And in 1980, there was actually still a sizable mental hospital, like inpatient mental hospital population. By 2000, it's 60,000 people nationwide or something, and it shrunk even further since then. So that's probably less of an issue. The one confounder we have for California is we do have several federal prisons in California, and since they would technically be part of that count, it may overstate California's incarceration rate by race to the extent that there's a disparity in the federal system. At one point, we tried to subtract those out, but that's very difficult to get a count by race for inmates that are located in California in the federal system.
And the federal system includes immigration detention as well.
That's right. Yeah. That's right.
Hi, I'm Sandra, a social work intern with the Vera Institute. On this topic of race, I was thinking about in school, my classmates and I are learning about the sort of lesser told story of Native American populations in the prison system and the disproportionate rate of incarceration of their communities. So I was wondering if in California that's a part of the discussion in looking at race issues, if they're included in the other category or what you've seen there.
So in this instance, at least what we were looking there, it's in the other category, right? And it's because we're pulling data from the census. It's not a complete enumeration of the population because it's just the American Community Survey, which is even smaller than the public use microdata sample in the past. Nonetheless, we have a sizable Native American population in California, and that's definitely worth looking into. I think CDCR, in their official statistics, they'll do tabs by race. The interesting thing about California's prison population is it's roughly third Black, Hispanic, non-Hispanic, white, and then there are some Asian inmates and there are some Native American inmates, but they're a relatively small part of the population. But I do think they have counts that you could look at if you wanted to.
So we're at time, and I would like to thank Dr. Raphael
Thank you all
for a great
coming.
presentation.